Rosaria's dinner always went straight up to the third floor. If she didn't eat it, take the plate away and ask no questions, and at 8 o'clock sharp, lock the door. Those were the first things the housekeeper told Josie on her first day inside the Sant'Angelo estate overlooking the bay. She nodded, though even in that moment, something about it didn't sit right with her. For 7 months, the mother of the most powerful man in Providence had barely touched a bite of food. The household told one another that age was quietly taking her strength, that she was tired, that she needed quiet, that she simply had no appetite anymore. Nobody asked a single question. Every evening the tray went up untouched and came back down untouched, but before throwing the food away, Josie was ordered to do something strange with it, something whose meaning she wouldn't understand until 2 weeks later. And the night she finally understood, she didn't carry the tray up at all. She went up empty-handed, opened the third-floor door, and walked the old woman down to the head of the dining table, in front of everyone. "Take her back to her room. Now," the daughter-in-law said, rising to her feet. But at that exact moment, the front door opened. A single question spoken at dinner that night shook the entire estate, because what everyone had spent 7 months calling an illness was hiding a truth that no one in that house, not even the most powerful man in the city, was prepared to hear. If Rosaria's story made you think of someone you love who might be eating alone tonight, leave a heart so she knows she isn't alone. Share this story with the person you haven't sat down to a meal with in far too long. And subscribe so you don't miss the stories still to come where empty chairs finally get filled again. At 6:30 that evening, Josie carried the tray up to the third floor. It was heavier than she had expected, not because of the food, but because of the way everything had been arranged. A spotless white cloth, silver cutlery, a small flower standing in a glass vase, every detail prepared, with the care one might give an honored guest at a hotel, rather than the mother of the man who owned the house. The staircase leading to the third floor was narrower than the ones below, and the carpet was so thick that her footsteps made no sound at all. When she reached the top, she saw that the door at the end of the hallway had already been left open by about the width of a hand. She paused for a moment, unsure whether she should knock or simply push it open, then tapped 3 times, very softly. A voice answered from inside, an elderly woman's voice, quiet but clear, telling her to come in. The room was large, with a high ceiling, and colder than the hallway outside. "Mrs." Rosaria sat in an armchair beside the window with her back to the door, her face turned toward the bay, where the lights aboard the ships were beginning to come on one by one in the fading evening. She didn't turn around right away. Josie set the tray on the small table beside her, lifted the cloth, and wished her a good evening. Only then did the old woman turn. She looked Josie over from head to toe, not suspiciously, merely with the gaze of someone who hadn't had a new person enter her room in a very long time. Then she smiled and thanked her. She thanked her twice, and the second time she spoke more slowly, as though she wanted to make certain Josie had heard. She asked her name. Josie told her. The old woman repeated it once, very softly, then said it was a beautiful name. Josie didn't know what to say to that, so she only lowered her head. "Mrs." Rosaria asked nothing else. She looked down at the tray of food and kept looking for a long time, long enough for Josie to think she was about to pick up the spoon, but then she raised her eyes toward the window again. Somewhere in the room, behind Josie, a clock was ticking. Josie stood there for exactly 3 minutes, just as she'd been instructed, and 3 minutes inside a silent room felt longer than 3 minutes anywhere else. She asked whether Mrs. Rosaria needed anything more. The old woman said no. "Go on downstairs, child, or they'll be waiting for you." Josie said goodnight and started to leave. But just as her hand touched the doorknob, something made her stop and look back one more time. On the windowsill beside the chair was a small porcelain plate, and on it lay a piece of bread that had dried hard, its edges darkened, clearly left there since morning. Beside it was a cup with a little cold tea still sitting at the bottom, and in the corner of the table stood a small bowl of soup, missing perhaps 3 or 4 spoonfuls, with a thin film of congealed fat hardened across the surface. The old woman wasn't starving herself. She did eat. She simply ate things that had gone cold. Things that didn't require anyone to carry them upstairs. Things she could put quietly into her mouth when no one was watching, eating just enough to keep her heart beating and her legs strong enough to rise. Josie closed the door behind her and stood in the hallway for another few seconds, her hand still resting on the knob. When she returned to the kitchen, she asked Mrs. Pruitt, trying to keep her voice perfectly ordinary, whether the old woman upstairs was all right. The housekeeper was wiping down the countertop and didn't look up. She said the doctor still came regularly, twice a month, and everything was properly documented. Then her hand stopped moving, And she added something she probably hadn't meant to say. She said that since spring, the old woman had lost nearly 22 pounds. So much that during the summer they'd had to send all of her clothes away to be altered. After saying it, she bent over the counter and resumed wiping, and she didn't say another word for the rest of the evening. 40 minutes later, Josie went upstairs to collect the tray. This time she didn't knock. She only pushed the door open gently and looked inside. Mrs. Rosaria was still sitting in the same position, still facing the bay. Outside, night had fully fallen, and the window now reflected her faintly in the glass like an old photograph. The tray remained untouched on the table. The napkin hadn't been unfolded. The cutlery hadn't been moved. The hot meal had gone completely cold, and the sauce had begun to form a skin around the edges of the plate. Josie picked up the tray, and as she bent down, she noticed the old woman's hand resting lightly on the arm of the chair. It was the hand of someone who had cooked all her life, the knuckles enlarged, blue veins raised beneath the thin skin on the back of it. On her ring finger was a worn gold wedding band. It had grown so loose that when she moved her finger slightly, the ring turned all the way around, slowly, then came to rest crooked against the side of her hand. Mrs. Rosaria lifted her other hand and turned it back into place, a gesture so familiar that she must have done it hundreds of times each day without even noticing anymore. Josie carried the tray out of the room. It wasn't until she had descended all 19 steps that she realized she'd been holding her breath the entire way. Josie set the tray down on the kitchen table and was about to do what anyone would have done: scrape the cold food into the trash and take the plate to the sink. But Mrs. Pruitt was already standing beside her, one hand braced against the counter, telling her to wait. She took a clean white porcelain dinner plate from the cabinet, the kind used for the main evening meal, set it down in front of Josie, and told her to transfer the food from the old plate onto the new one. Josie did as she was told without understanding why. The housekeeper picked up the fork and loosened the meat and vegetables, turning them over several times, spreading the sauce toward the edge of the plate, as though someone had already eaten part of the meal. Then she removed about 1/3 of it, scraped that portion into the trash, arranged what remained slightly off to one side, and laid the knife and fork across each other on the rim of the plate, exactly the way someone might leave them after finishing dinner. She stepped back half a pace and studied it the way a person might study a painting, then adjusted the napkin so it looked slightly rumpled. After that, she pulled her phone from the pocket of her apron, held it above the plate, and took a photograph from directly overhead. She looked at the picture, seemed dissatisfied, moved the plate closer to where the light was better, and took another one. When she was finished, she put the phone away and told Josie she could throw everything out now. Josie didn't move. She asked what all of that was for. Mrs. Pruitt was turning on the faucet and didn't look back. She told her to just do it and not ask questions. Josie asked again, more quietly this time, who the photographs were being sent to. The housekeeper turned off the water, and this time she faced Josie and looked directly at her. She said there were things in this house people paid her to do, and there were things people paid her not to ask about, and her life would be much easier if she learned the difference between the two during her first week. Then she added that starting tomorrow, Josie would be the one taking the pictures, because that was part of the job of whoever carried the tray. She walked out of the kitchen, leaving the white plate untouched on the table, the food arranged upon it into a very carefully constructed lie. Josie stood there looking at it for a long time. Something had begun to stir inside her, something without a clear shape, only the feeling that she had just been given a task she shouldn't be doing. Then she thought about the number in her bank account, thought about the temporary plastic marker at the cemetery that she still couldn't afford to replace, and she picked up the plate, scraped everything into the trash, and washed it. The following evening, she did it herself. She transferred the food onto a clean plate, loosened it with the fork, removed about 1/3, crossed the knife and fork, and raised her phone to take the picture. Her hand trembled slightly, so the first photograph came out blurred, and she had to take another. She sent it to the phone number Mrs. Pruitt had already written down for her on a scrap of paper, with no name beside it, only 10 digits. She did the same thing night after night, and no one offered another word of explanation. Near the end of her first week, one afternoon while Josie was kneading dough, the kitchen door suddenly swung open and a little girl came running in. She was about 7 years old, with 2 braids that had nearly come undone, carrying a box of crayons in one hand, and she climbed onto the high stool at the corner of the kitchen table, with the easy familiarity of someone who had sat there many times before. She introduced herself as Nella, asked whether Josie was the new girl, then, without waiting for an answer, immediately asked whether there were any cookies today. Josie handed her a warm cookie fresh from the oven. The little girl ate while she drew, her legs swinging beneath the stool, talking without pause about one thing after another. She said her teacher at school had told her she was the best artist in the class. She said her grandmother knew how to fold napkins into rabbits, that it took her only a few seconds to make one, and the rabbit even had 2 ears standing straight up, and that her grandmother had tried to teach her, but no matter how many times she practiced, one ear always fell over to the side. She burst into bright laughter when she got to that part. Then she finished the drawing, lifted the paper and blew on it as if to dry it, and held it out proudly. In the picture was a white-haired woman standing in front of a large red pot, holding a ladle, with little circles floating all around her that the child explained were the delicious smells rising into the air. She said it was Grandma making tomato sauce, and that Grandma made the best sauce in the whole house, better than any restaurant. Josie told her the picture was beautiful. The little girl's eyes crinkled with delight at the praise. Then she pushed the paper toward Josie and said, "Miss Josie, when you go upstairs later, will you give this picture to Grandma for me?" Then she slid down from the stool, grabbed another cookie, and ran back into the hallway, her laughter echoing behind her for several moments. Josie held the drawing in her hands, the crayon still not completely dry in one corner. She looked toward the kitchen door that had just swung shut. The house had only 3 floors. From where the little girl had been sitting to the room at the end of the hallway upstairs, there couldn't have been more than 40 steps. And yet a 7-year-old child who wanted to give her grandmother a picture she'd drawn had to ask a housemaid who'd been working there for only a week to carry it for her. Nella's drawing didn't make it up to the 3rd floor that evening. Josie had meant to carry it up with the dinner tray, but just as she placed it along the edge, Mrs. Pruitt passed by, looked down at the sheet of paper, picked it up, and set it aside without saying a word, giving only the smallest shake of her head. Josie folded the drawing, slipped it into the pocket of her apron, and left it there for the next several days. On Tuesday morning that week, she was setting a stock pot on the stove when she heard tires grinding over the gravel drive outside. Through the kitchen window, she saw 3 black cars coming in one behind another. None of them honked. None stopped at the gate. The iron gate had already been opened, as though someone had known exactly when they were arriving. 6 men stepped out. Not one of them carried a briefcase, and not one looked around. They walked straight through the front entrance in a single line, while 2 of them broke away and took positions on either side of the library door, hands folded in front of their stomachs, backs turned toward the hallway. Josie noticed something strange. From the moment the cars entered the grounds until the library door closed, not a single greeting was spoken anywhere in the house. Mrs. Pruitt appeared in the kitchen from somewhere, moving more quickly than usual. She told Josie to stay in there for the day. If she needed anything, she was to ring the bell. She wasn't to go into the hallway, and she wasn't to go upstairs. Josie asked what she should do about lunch. The housekeeper said to prepare it as usual, and someone would come down to collect it. Then she left and pulled the kitchen door shut behind her, a door that hadn't once been closed since the day Josie arrived. For the next 4 hours, Josie remained inside the sealed kitchen, listening to footsteps passing back and forth across the wooden floor beyond the door. Every so often she heard someone say something brief, followed by silence. There was no arguing, no raised voices. It was the silence itself that made her pay attention. Around noon, someone knocked on the kitchen door. A man Josie had never seen before came in, took the coffee tray, and left immediately without looking at her even once. Shortly before 4 in the afternoon, the 3 cars drove away, as quietly as they had arrived. By evening, everything had gone back to normal. The dining table was set, the tray was carried up to the 3rd floor, the clean white plate was arranged into its familiar lie, and the photograph was sent. But when Josie returned to the staff quarters behind the main house, she couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness, took out her phone, and typed into the search bar the last name she had written on her employment contract her first day there. The results appeared immediately, so many that she had to scroll down the screen. She read the first line. She read the second. Halfway through the third, she pressed the power button, laid the phone face down on her lap, and didn't pick it up again. The only light in the room came from the lamp in the yard outside, casting a slanted strip of brightness across the wall. Josie sat like that for a very long time, so long that when she finally moved, both of her feet had gone numb. She thought about the iron gate already standing open. She thought about the 2 men stationed with their backs to the library door. She thought about the 4 pages of confidentiality agreements she had signed without reading all the way through, and she realized that whatever made people require a cook to sign 4 pages like that was never going to be about cooking. In her mind, she could see very clearly what she would do the next morning. She would write a short resignation letter, leave it on the kitchen table, pack her bag, walk out through the gate, and catch a bus back to the city. She even thought of the first sentence of the letter. Then she picked up her phone, not to keep reading the search results, but to open her banking app. The screen lit up in the darkness and showed her 2 numbers. The first was the amount of money left in her account, and it was so small she didn't want to look at it for long. The second was the amount she still owed the nursing facility, $41,000, plus interest that crept a little higher each month. Patient and steady as something that never grew tired, Josie stared at that number for a long time. Then she thought about a September afternoon 14 months earlier. She thought about the 1-hour drive that had taken her 5 hours that day, and about how even now, the grave of the woman who had waited for her through that entire afternoon was still marked only by a white plastic sign leaning crooked in the grass. The kind funeral homes put there temporarily for families who haven't finished paying what they owe. She turned off the phone, set it on the table, and lay down. The next morning, she got up at 5:30, tied on her apron, and set the stockpot on the stove just as she did every day. That resignation letter was never written. Josie had been working in that house well into her 2nd week, and still hadn't once seen the owner's face. She knew he was there because every morning a cup of coffee disappeared from the kitchen before 6 o'clock, because the coats hanging in the hall closet changed from one day to the next, because every so often she heard a car door close outside while the sky was still dark. No one in the house called him by name. They said the boss, or simply him, and whenever those words were mentioned, whatever conversation had been going on seemed to pause for a beat. She finally met him on Thursday night. It was nearly 9 o'clock. She had just brought the tray down from the 3rd floor and was walking along the hallway when she heard the front door open below, followed by footsteps climbing the stairs, heavy and even, never hurried. She stepped back into the recessed space at the end of the hall beside the linen cabinet and stood there motionless with the tray in her hands. The man reached the final stair and stopped for a second to straighten one cuff. He was tall, with black hair already gone completely gray at both temples, even though his face was still young, and a scar cut across his left eyebrow, dividing it cleanly in 2. He was still wearing his overcoat, the collar faintly damp with mist. He walked to the end of the hallway, stopped outside his mother's room, and knocked 3 times. Josie stood about 10 steps away, barely daring to breathe, and she began counting silently because she didn't know what else to do. A voice answered from inside. He didn't open the door all the way. He only cracked it open and remained standing on the threshold, one hand still resting on the knob. He asked whether his mother had eaten dinner. The old woman answered that she had. He asked how she had felt that day. She said she was fine. He asked whether she needed anything. She said she didn't need anything and told him to go rest because it was late. He said yes. Sleep well, mother. Then he closed the door. Josie counted to 40. 40 seconds from the moment his hand touched the door until it shut again. He didn't step into the room. He didn't pull out a chair and sit down. He didn't take off his coat. Didn't set anything down. Didn't turn on another lamp. He walked back along the hallway and past the place where Josie stood. He saw her. She was certain he saw her, but his eyes moved over her the way they might move over a cabinet or a picture hanging on the wall, without stopping for even half a moment. At the top of the stairs, he paused. He placed one hand on the banister and stood there, his face turned slightly back toward the dark hallway and the last door at the end of it. Josie saw his shoulders lift as though he were about to turn around. She stayed perfectly still, and in that moment she found herself hoping he would go back so strongly that the feeling surprised her. But he only stood there for a few seconds. Then the hand gripping the banister tightened once, and he went downstairs. Josie waited until the sound of his footsteps had disappeared before stepping out of the alcove. There was a late supper downstairs that night. Several men were eating in the smaller dining room, and Josie had to carry food out twice more. On the second trip, she heard one of them giving some kind of report about the harbor. His voice had sounded ordinary at first, but the longer he spoke, the slower he became, and the more often he lifted a hand to adjust his collar. He said a shipment had been held since Tuesday afternoon, and that someone else had already signed the papers before they ever reached their side. Josie set down the plates and stepped back. At the head of the table, Rocco said nothing for a long while. He cut the meat on his plate, finished eating it, laid down his knife and fork, wiped his mouth, and folded his napkin neatly into a square. Then he asked who had signed. He didn't shout. If anything, his voice dropped lower than usual, so quiet that the man at the far end of the table had to lean forward to hear him, and the instant his voice became that soft, the entire table went still. No one touched their knife or fork anymore. The man who had been giving the report straightened in his chair, placed both hands in his lap, and answered with a name. Rocco gave a very slight nod and said, "All right, leave it there." That was all. Then he turned to the man beside him and asked about something else, his voice returning to normal. The meal continued, but no one laughed again. Josie went back into the kitchen, placed one hand against the cold stone countertop, and understood something about this man. Something the entire house had known for a long time, and no one needed to say aloud. People were usually afraid of men who shouted. But in this house, what made everyone fall silent was when the boss lowered his voice. The angrier he became, the quieter he spoke. And that evening, standing in the doorway of his mother's room, he had spoken very softly. Josie couldn't get that thought out of her mind. By the second week, Josie had grown so used to the routine that she no longer had to think about it. She carried the tray upstairs at 6:30, stood there for exactly 3 minutes, came back down, waited 40 minutes, went up to collect the tray, transferred the food onto the white plate, loosened it with the fork, removed 1/3, crossed the knife and fork on the rim, raised her phone and took the picture, sent it to the 10-digit number with no name attached, then threw the food away and washed the dishes. The entire process took less than 4 minutes. Some evenings she finished without even remembering that she'd done it, the way a person locks the front door and gets halfway down the road before suddenly wondering whether they locked it at all. She still didn't know who the 10-digit number belonged to. She tried asking once more, this time when Mrs. Pruitt was in a good mood, but the housekeeper only said it belonged to the healthcare people, that they needed to monitor how much the old woman was eating, nothing more. The answer sounded reasonable enough. Josie managed to convince herself that it was reasonable for several more days. On Tuesday evening that week, Mrs. Pruitt's back was hurting and she had gone to her room early to lie down, so when the bell rang from the library, Josie was the one who had to answer it. She carried the coffee tray upstairs, knocked, and received no reply. She pushed the door open. The library was empty. The desk lamp was still on, the only light in the room, casting a pool of brightness over the dark wooden desk, while everything else lay in shadow. On the desk sat 2 empty coffee cups, an ashtray, several stacks of files, and a phone lying face down. Josie set the tray on the edge of the desk and began clearing away the old cups and saucers. She picked up the first cup. At that exact moment, the phone gave a short vibration against the wood, and the screen lit up, throwing a pale blue glow toward the ceiling. It didn't unlock. It was only a notification appearing in the middle of the screen, the kind anyone standing nearby could read without touching a thing. Josie glanced down by instinct. Then she couldn't look away. On the screen was a small photograph. A white porcelain plate seen from above, the food loosened and spread to one side, the sauce beginning to set around the edge. The knife and fork crossed over the rim. The napkin was rumpled in one corner of the frame. Josie recognized the picture immediately, not because it resembled all the others, but because she clearly remembered placing the fork slightly crooked the night before, and thinking about straightening it, then deciding to leave it alone. The fork in the photograph was still crooked in exactly the same way. Beneath the picture was a line of text. It said that his mother had eaten 2/3 of her dinner, and that she sent her regards. Josie stood perfectly still in the library, one hand still holding the empty cup. There were no thoughts in her head at all, only a flat, endless blankness. And inside that blankness, one thing after another began falling into place with a cold and terrible order. The recipient wasn't a doctor. There was no healthcare service. The 10-digit number ended at a phone lying face down on the library desk of the woman's own son. Every night, after standing for 40 seconds in the doorway and hearing his mother say she was fine, that man came back here, sat beneath this lamp, and received a photograph proving that his mother had eaten 2/3 of her dinner. He looked at the picture. He believed it. Why wouldn't he, when the proof was right there in front of him? When the food had been loosened exactly the way it would look after someone had eaten? When the knife and fork were crossed exactly the way his mother had placed them all her life? And the person who loosened the food that way, the person who removed exactly 1/3, the person who crossed the knife and fork and then lifted her phone to find the best light, that person was Josie, not Mrs. Pruitt. The housekeeper had demonstrated it once, and then handed the task over. For the past 2 weeks, night after night, Josie's own hands had created that proof and pressed send. She wasn't merely witnessing the lie. She was making it. Every photograph she sent bought another night in which that man could rest easy, believing his mother was eating normally upstairs. Another night in which no one walked into that room. Another night in which the door was locked at 8 o'clock, and no one thought there was anything worth questioning. She had sold him 40 seconds of peace each evening, in exchange for 4 minutes of her own time downstairs in the kitchen. Josie set the cup down. She missed the saucer, and porcelain struck porcelain with a hard, dry sound in the silent room. She picked up the tray, walked out of the library, closed the door behind her, and made it exactly 3 steps into the hallway before she had to stop. The cups on the tray rattled against one another. She looked down at her 2 hands, hands covered in oil-burned scars and knife marks from 10 years spent working in kitchens, hands that had never trembled in front of a pan of boiling grease. They were shaking so badly she couldn't hold the tray. She had to bend down, set it completely on the hallway floor, then straighten again, press her back against the wall in the darkness, and remain there for a very long time. The following evening, Josie still took the photograph and still pressed send, because she hadn't figured out any other way yet. And because she understood that if no picture was sent that night, she would be the first person questioned, and she would lose her job before she had the chance to learn anything more. But after she finished washing the last of the dishes, she didn't return to the staff quarters as she usually did. She took a stack of clean bath towels from the linen closet, the kind of thing anyone who happened to see her would believe she was simply putting away, and went up to the 3rd floor. No one was there. She walked the length of the hallway, opened the linen cupboard in the recessed alcove at the far end, folded the towels into place very slowly, and then stood there. There were only 2 lights in the 3rd floor hallway, both turned down to their lowest setting. From where she stood, looking toward the end of the corridor, she could see a narrow strip of yellow light spilling across the wooden floor from beneath Mrs. Rosaria's door. Josie waited. She could hear the tall clock on the 2nd floor, landing striking softly, the sound carrying upward through the house. 7:40, 7:50. Then, just as the hands reached 8 o'clock, footsteps began climbing the stairs, steady and unhurried. The footsteps of someone who had walked this exact distance, at this exact hour for many months. Mrs. Pruitt passed by, glanced once at Josie standing beside the linen cupboard, and asked nothing. She went straight to the end of the hallway. She didn't knock. She didn't call through the door with a greeting or wish the old woman good night. She reached into the pocket of her apron, took out a ring of keys, selected one, slid it into the lock, and turned it. The click of the lock in the silent hallway was so clear that Josie flinched even though she had known it was coming. Then the housekeeper placed her hand on the doorknob and tested it. She shook it once. She let go, then gripped it again, and shook it a second time, more carefully, as though once wasn't enough to be certain. When she was satisfied, she slipped the keys back into her pocket, turned around, and went downstairs. Josie stayed where she was. She stared at the strip of yellow light beneath the door. She waited for a knock. She waited for a voice, a question, the sound of the knob turning from the inside. Anything at all. Nothing came. The strip of yellow light remained still across the floorboards. About 10 minutes later, it went dark, and the hallway fell completely into shadow. That silence was what sent a chill down Josie's spine, even more than the sound of the lock had, because someone locked in for the first time would ask why. Someone locked in for the 2nd or 3rd time would become angry. Only someone who had been locked behind that door for hundreds of nights in a row would simply lie down and turn off the light at the usual hour without asking a single question, because she had already asked them all and already knew no one would answer. Josie went back downstairs and sat in the kitchen for a long time. Close to 10 o'clock, Mrs. Pruitt came down for hot water and hesitated slightly when she saw Josie still sitting there. Josie stood. She asked directly, keeping her voice as ordinary as she could. Why, Mrs. Rosaria's door had to be locked. Mrs. Pruitt didn't answer right away. She poured water into a pitcher and put the lid on. Josie asked what would happen if the old woman needed to come out during the night, or needed to call someone, or if something happened to her. Mrs. Pruitt still said nothing. Josie added that she was asking because she was the one who carried the meals up there every day, and if anything went wrong, people would ask her first. That seemed to touch something, because the housekeeper's hands stopped completely. She stood with her back to Josie for a moment. Then she turned around, and for the first time in 2 weeks, Josie saw something on the 57-year-old woman's face that wasn't irritation or coldness, but a deep exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that came from carrying something for far too long. Mrs. Pruitt opened her mouth as though she were going to speak, then stopped herself. In the end, she said only one sentence, quietly, almost like advice rather than refusal. She told Josie she was asking the wrong person. Then she picked up the pitcher and walked out of the kitchen, without looking back. Josie stood alone beneath the kitchen lights. She was asking the wrong person, which meant there was a right person to ask, which meant Mrs. Pruitt herself was only the person holding the keys, not the one giving the order. And she knew it, and she had known it for a long time. Josie thought about the ring of keys in the housekeeper's apron pocket, thought about the 2 careful pulls on the doorknob. People didn't check a lock a second time because they were afraid it hadn't caught. They checked it a second time because someone had told them to make sure twice. The following afternoon, Josie took Nella's drawing out of her apron pocket, smoothed the 4 curled corners flat, and slipped it onto the tray beneath the napkin so no one would see it. She carried the tray up to the 3rd floor 15 minutes earlier than usual, while everyone downstairs was still busy and no one was paying attention to the stairs. Mrs. Rosaria was sitting in the armchair by the window just as she did every day. Josie set the tray down, lifted the cloth, and instead of stepping back to wait for 3 minutes as she had done for the past 2 weeks, she pulled the wooden chair from the corner of the room, brought it closer, and sat down across from the old woman. Mrs. Rosaria raised her eyes slightly and looked at her, not surprised, only tilting her head a little as though considering something. Then she said, "Sit down, child." The two of them remained silent for a while. Outside, the sky was turning the color of lead. The surface of the bay lay perfectly still, and far in the distance a tugboat was moving very slowly toward shore. Mrs. Rosaria asked how long she'd been working there. Josie said 2 weeks, ma'am. The old woman nodded. Then she asked a question Josie hadn't prepared for. She asked why a young woman like her would take a job in a place like this. Josie fell silent. She looked down at her hands resting in her lap, at the oil-burned scars running along her index finger and across the back of her hand, marks left by 10 years spent standing in front of stoves, inside cramped kitchens, at roadside diners. She had prepared several safe answers in her head. Things like, the pay is good, I needed work, I just lost my last job. But sitting in that cold room, across from a woman no one had sat facing for 7 months, she couldn't bring herself to say any of them. In the end, she only said, "I was 4 hours late once, ma'am." Then she added, "Only 4 hours." She explained nothing more. She didn't say where she had been late to, didn't say why, didn't say what had been waiting on the small table beside the bed that day. Mrs. Rosaria didn't ask. She looked at Josie for a long time, so long that Josie had to turn her face away, and there was something in that gaze that made her understand the old woman didn't need any more details, that some sentences only had to be spoken halfway for someone who had lived through something similar to understand everything that remained unsaid. Mrs. Rosaria reached out, touched the back of Josie's hand very lightly, then drew her hand away. Josie straightened, lifted the napkin from the tray, and took out the drawing. She said, "I have something for you. I've been keeping it for a few days because I couldn't bring it up sooner." Mrs. Rosaria looked at the sheet of paper in Josie's hands, and for a second, she didn't understand what it was. Then she did. She raised both hands to receive it. Not one hand, but both, the way someone accepts something fragile. She laid the drawing across her lap, smoothed the crease flat, and bent her head over it for a long time. She pointed to the red pot and said the little girl had drawn the right one, the biggest pot, the only one large enough to hold that many tomatoes. Then she pointed to the little circles floating above it, and laughed. She said, "The smell. That child even drew the smell." She laughed for a little while. Then the laughter slowly faded, and she said nothing more. She simply sat there with the paper on her lap, rubbing one corner of it back and forth with her thumb. Josie looked at the hot meal still untouched on the tray, the sauce already beginning to form a skin around the edge of the plate just as it did every evening. She asked if Mrs. Rosaria wanted her to cook something else. She said she could make many things, whatever she liked, and she could make it fresh tomorrow. Mrs. Rosaria didn't answer right away. She turned toward the window and looked out across the bay, where the tugboat from earlier had already disappeared behind the point. Then she spoke very softly, almost as though she were talking to herself. She said, "It isn't the food, child." She said, "When you eat alone, it isn't a meal anymore. It's only something you have to finish." The words fell between them and remained there, heavier than all the silences that had come before. Josie sat a little longer without knowing what to say. Then she stood, picked up the tray, and started toward the door. Mrs. Rosaria still held the drawing in her lap. When Josie reached the doorway, she looked back and saw that the old woman had propped the picture upright on the windowsill against the glass, beside the porcelain plate holding the piece of dry bread. Josie descended all 19 steps, set the tray down on the kitchen table, and stood there looking at the cold food she now understood no one would ever touch. For 2 weeks, she had been searching for the answer in the food itself. She had thought perhaps the meals weren't to the old woman's taste, perhaps her teeth hurt, perhaps the medicine had taken away her appetite, perhaps it truly was simply old age, as people always said. It wasn't. There was nothing wrong with anything on that tray. What was missing wasn't on the tray at all. The woman on the 3rd floor wasn't hungry for food. Josie slept badly that night, and the next morning she worked like someone counting down towards something she still couldn't name. She asked Mrs. Pruitt one more question, the only one she thought was harmless. She asked whether the old woman ever came downstairs to eat with the family. The housekeeper answered simply that she didn't, then walked away to attend to something else. At lunchtime, instead of staying in the kitchen, Josie took 2 sandwiches with her and went out into the garden. Mr. Ezra was trimming the hedge at the far end of the lawn, where the ground looked straight out over the bay. He had worked there for 30 years and was the only person in the house who had greeted Josie by name from her very first day. She handed him one of the sandwiches. He took it, nodded his thanks, then turned back to his work. Josie stood there for a while, watching the shears move in his hands, and asked whether, after being there so long, he must have known Mrs. Rosaria before all of this. The shears and Mr. Ezra's hands paused for a beat, then started moving again. He didn't turn around. He said he had known her back when she still drove herself to the market every Saturday morning, chose her own tomatoes, carried them back herself, and wouldn't let anyone help. He said that in those days, every Sunday evening the whole family ate in the large dining room, every single person present, and the old woman began cooking at 8 o'clock in the morning, making a pot of tomato sauce so large that the smell drifted all the way out there, all the way to the spot where he was standing now. He said that smell was how he knew it was Sunday, without ever looking at a calendar. Josie asked what happened after that. Mr. Ezra still didn't turn around. He said then the young master got married. He said there was nothing unusual about that. Every man gets married. Then he was quiet for a while, made a few more cuts, and said that at first there wasn't anything at all. At first there were only polite little suggestions. On evenings when there were many guests, someone would say she should rest, that too many people would tire her, that it would be better for her to eat in her room where it was quiet. It sounded reasonable to everyone, including the old woman herself. She even thanked them for thinking of her. Then came the matter of timing. Someone said dinner in that house was too late, that eating late was hard on an elderly person's digestion, so perhaps she should eat an hour earlier and sleep better. That sounded reasonable too. Then they said the stairs were slippery, and it was dangerous for her to come down at night. That sounded reasonable as well. He said every time it happened, there was another kind and sensible reason attached to it, and every reason was supposedly for her own good. Josie asked when, exactly, the old woman stopped coming downstairs. That was when Mr. Ezra finally lowered the shears. He straightened, looked out over the bay, and said there had never been a day like that. He said there was no single day when anyone sent her upstairs. No one ever pointed toward the staircase. No one ever said anything openly cruel. And if Josie went through the house now and asked every person in it, not one of them could tell her when the change had happened. Then he said something Josie would remember for the rest of her life. He said it was only that every month, her chair moved a little farther away. He said at first she sat at the head of the table. Then she sat off to one side, because there were guests. Then she ate an hour before everyone else. Then she ate in the smaller dining room. Then the tray began going upstairs. Every step was so small that no one felt there was anything worth objecting to. But when all those steps were added together, it had been 7 months since anyone had seen her sit down at the table. He said he had been gardening for 30 years, and he knew how people killed a tree without ever cutting it down. You just remove one branch each season, and every branch has a reason. Trim it to make the shape neater. Trim it to let more air through. Trim it so it doesn't block the light from another tree. Then one day you look again, and there aren't enough leaves left to keep it alive. And no one has technically done anything wrong. Josie stood still. She asked whether no one in the house had ever said anything. Mr. Ezra bent down and gathered the cut branches into the wheelbarrow. He said there had been one person, Mrs. Doyle, the cook before Josie. Josie asked what she'd said. He said she hadn't said anything at all. She had only asked a question. One question. Right there in the kitchen. She had asked why they needed to photograph the leftover food before throwing it away. Josie felt a chill run down her spine. She asked what happened after that. Mr. Ezra had already pushed the wheelbarrow several steps away before he answered. He said she didn't come back the next day. Not a week later, not at the end of the month. The very next day, they paid her everything she was owed, sent a car to take her all the way home, and no one in that house ever mentioned her name again. He said she had cooked there for 11 years. Then he pushed the wheelbarrow toward the shed, and just before he disappeared behind the bushes, he called back one final sentence, his voice still as even as if he were talking about the weather. He said, "She's in Pawtucket now, miss." Josie had 1 day off every 2 weeks, and she used that day to go to Pawtucket. Finding the address wasn't difficult. All she had to do was ask Mr. Ezra one more question the following morning, and he recited the street name without having to think, as though he'd been keeping it ready in his mind for 6 months, waiting for someone to finally ask. It was an old 4-story building with no buzzer at the entrance, a narrow staircase, and the smell of dampness trapped in the walls. The apartment was on the 3rd floor at the end of the hallway. Josie knocked. She heard footsteps inside, then the faint sound of someone looking through the peephole, followed by silence. She knocked again and said her name was Josie, that she worked in the kitchen at the Sant'Angelo house. Immediately, she heard the lock slide into place from the other side. A woman's voice called through the door and told her to go home. Said she'd already signed the papers. She wasn't going to say anything. Just go home. Josie stood in the hallway with one hand still resting against the door. She knew she had only a few seconds before the woman inside walked away into another room, and she didn't have time to think of anything clever to say. So she said the only thing left in her mind. She said, "I'm not here to ask you about that house, ma'am." She said her mother had died alone in a nursing home at noon that day, and they told her the lunch tray had still been sitting untouched beside the bed. She said she had arrived 4 hours late. Then she fell silent. There was no sound from inside. Josie waited. She was about to turn away when she heard the bolt being drawn back. Then the door opened, and a woman of about 60 stood there, holding a dish towel in one hand, looking at her with red-rimmed eyes. "Mrs." Doyle said nothing. She simply stepped back to let her in. The apartment was small and warm and smelled of onions frying in oil. She poured Josie a cup of tea and sat down across from her. She said she'd known someone would come looking for her one day. She just hadn't expected it to take this long. She told Josie she'd cooked in that house for 11 years. She knew Mrs. Rosaria's tastes by heart. She knew the old woman preferred her food lightly seasoned, knew she couldn't eat raw onions, knew that every Sunday morning 2 pounds of ripe tomatoes had to be waiting on the kitchen table, so Mrs. Rosaria could make the sauce herself. Then she came to the part where everything changed. She said the photographs had started sometime around April. At first, she'd gone along with it too, assuming it must be for the doctor to monitor what the old woman was eating. But after doing it for about 2 months, she began to realize something wasn't right. Because if it was really for a doctor, why did the food have to be loosened and spread around? Why did exactly 1/3 have to be removed? Why did the knife and fork have to be crossed, so it looked as though someone had just finished eating? What doctor needed a staged photograph? She said she'd asked that question in the kitchen, asked it only once, and louder than necessary because she'd been angry at the time. That afternoon, someone came down to speak with her very politely and said the household was reorganizing its staff. The next morning, she wasn't allowed through the gate. They paid her everything she was owed, added another 3 months of wages, put a confidentiality agreement in front of her to sign, and sent a car to drive her all the way home. She said, 11 years, and they finished with me in less than a day. Josie asked whether she'd reported it to anyone. Mrs. Doyle was quiet for a long time. Then she said she'd written a letter. She said she'd written to the young master, 3 handwritten pages, telling him exactly what she knew, no more and no less, asking for nothing, only telling him that his mother wasn't eating, that the photographs he received every evening were being staged by the kitchen staff, and that he needed to go upstairs and see for himself. She said she'd mailed that letter 7 months ago. Josie asked what happened after that. Mrs. Doyle shrugged, and there were 6 months of bitterness held inside that small movement. She said nothing happened. No one called her back. No one came to ask questions. Nothing changed. She said she'd comforted herself by believing the letter must have been lost, that someone had put it in the wrong mailbox, that maybe it reached someone in the house and was thrown away before it ever made it to his desk. She said she needed to believe that, because she couldn't bear the other possibility. Josie set down her tea. She asked whether Mrs. Doyle was certain the letter hadn't arrived. Mrs. Doyle looked at her. Then she stood, walked to the small cabinet beside the window, opened the second drawer, and searched beneath a stack of old papers. She took out a small piece of ivory-colored paper, the kind the post office gives back to the sender, and carried it to the table without handing it over right away. She said, "I sent it certified." She said, "I didn't dare put it in the mailbox at that house. I went all the way to the post office and paid extra for a signature because I wanted to know Then she handed the paper to Josie. It showed the date it had been mailed, the address of the estate by the bay, and in the final box, the space reserved for the recipient, there was a signature. It had been written quickly, slanting to the right, compressed into 3 neat strokes. "Mrs. Doyle said, I've kept this for 7 months because I can't make sense of it." Then she said, "Take it." Josie kept the receipt tucked inside her coat pocket for 3 days. She didn't know what she intended to do with it. She only knew that the 3-stroke signature slanting to the right belonged to someone in that house, and that 7 months earlier, that person had held Mrs. Doyle's 3-page letter in their hands, and then done nothing. She thought about Mrs. Pruitt, thought about the personnel manager, thought about anyone who might have gone to the gate to accept registered mail. She needed a handwriting sample to compare it with, and she had no idea where to find one until Thursday afternoon, when she went up to the 3rd floor to put away a stack of clean towels and noticed the filing cabinet standing in the corner of the hallway. It was a low wooden cabinet pushed against the wall, the kind of thing Josie had passed hundreds of times without ever paying attention to. On top of it sat an artificial plant and a small night lamp. She opened the top drawer. Inside were several thin folders, the ordinary paperwork any household employing someone to care for an elderly person might keep: emergency contact numbers, room cleaning schedules, linen changing schedules, records of the doctor's visits. There was nothing secret about any of it, and precisely because there was nothing secret, it had been left right there in the hallway where anyone could reach it. Josie turned to the 3rd folder and stopped. It contained a printed sheet with a title clearly stating that it was the nighttime safety procedure for an elderly family member. Beneath the heading were several typed lines, brief and dry, written in the kind of language no reasonable person could object to. It stated that in order to prevent the risk of nighttime falls following an incident in February, the bedroom door would be locked from the outside at 8 o'clock each evening and reopened at 6 o'clock in the morning. It stated that the housekeeper would hold the key and was required to test the doorknob twice after locking it. It stated that the procedure was being carried out according to medical recommendation. In the lower left corner was the full signature of Dr. Warren Hollis, along with his medical license number. And in the lower right corner, inside a small box labeled Only Approved, there was an abbreviated signature: 3 strokes, slanting to the right. Josie stood frozen in the middle of the 3rd floor hallway with the sheet in her hand. Then she reached into her coat pocket with her other hand, took out the postal receipt, unfolded it with fingers that had already begun to stop obeying her, and placed the 2 pieces of paper side by side beneath the dim light of the small lamp on top of the cabinet. She didn't need to be an expert to see it. The first stroke flicked upward and then broke sharply downward. The second stretched into a narrow curve. The third was a short horizontal line cutting across the other 2. The same hurried hand, the same slant, the same person. Josie read the safety procedure again from the beginning, more slowly this time, as though the words might somehow say something different if she gave them another chance. They didn't. The person who had signed for the letter of complaint 7 months earlier, the letter explaining that his mother wasn't eating and that the photographs sent every evening were staged, and the person who had approved locking his own mother's bedroom door every night at 8 o'clock, were the same person. It was Rocco. Josie sat down on the top step of the 3rd floor staircase, with both pieces of paper resting across her lap, and she remained there for a long time. Over the past 2 weeks, she had built a simple story in her mind, and she realized now that she'd clung to it because it was easier to live with. In that story, there was a woman from somewhere else, clever and cold, building a cage around her mother-in-law one careful step at a time, and there was a busy son who left before dawn and returned close to 9 o'clock at night, deceived inside his own home. In that story, all anyone had to do was pull back the curtain. All anyone had to do was make him see the truth, and everything would collapse, and then be put right again. Josie had believed that story for 2 weeks because it gave her something to do, but that 3-stroke signature had just torn it in half. No one was deceiving him. Someone had placed that paper on his desk, and he had signed it. Someone had put 3 pages into his hands explaining exactly what was happening, and he had signed for them. The lock turning every night at 8 o'clock in this hallway wasn't being turned by the daughter-in-law. It was being turned by a scribbled signature in the lower right corner of an A4 sheet of paper, signed between 2 meetings, perhaps without being fully read, perhaps after nothing more than a glance at words like safety and prevention and medical recommendation before he signed. Josie thought about the 40 seconds at the doorway. She thought about the hand tightening around the stair rail, and she understood that this story wasn't simply about a cruel daughter-in-law. It was something far more uncomfortable, something without a single person you could point to and name as the villain. That woman had only prepared the papers. The person locking his mother inside her room every night was her own son, and he had no idea he was doing it. On Friday morning, one of the maids came down to the kitchen and said Mrs. Voss wanted to see her in the study. Josie took off her apron, washed her hands, and on the way upstairs she slipped the 2 pieces of paper into the inner lining of the cloth bag she always kept hanging behind the kitchen door, because she didn't know what was about to happen, but she knew she couldn't have them on her. Corinne's study was on the 2nd floor, with windows overlooking the front drive. The woman was sitting behind her desk. She didn't stand, didn't invite Josie to sit, only looked up at her once before lowering her eyes again and straightening a stack of papers in front of her. Josie stood there. Corinne said she'd been working there for 19 days now, hadn't she? Josie said yes. Corinne said she'd taken a look through her records. Then, she slid the stack of papers across the desk toward Josie, gently, the way someone might slide a cup of tea toward a guest. Josie looked down. Her mother's name was on the first page, Marion Whitaker. Beneath it was a copy of her medical record, the date she had been admitted to the state nursing facility, her diagnosis, her treatments, and at the bottom of the page, the date of her death. The second page was a statement of nursing home charges, month by month, amounts listed in the right-hand column, dates in the left, with every unpaid line highlighted in yellow. The third page was a debt summary, showing the name of the collection agency, the final balance calculated down to the last cent, and the interest accrued through the current month. The fourth page was a copy of the nursing facility's incident report, recording the time the nurse found her, the condition of the room when she was found, noting that lunch had been brought in at 11:40 and hadn't been touched. And on the final line, under the section for family notes, was the time the patient's daughter arrived. Josie read that time. She knew that time. She had lived with that number for 14 months, had calculated it over and over on nights when she couldn't sleep, had known that if she hadn't stopped for gas that day, if she hadn't waited for roadside assistance to tow her broken car, if she'd called a taxi from the beginning instead of trying to save $60, she would have made it in time. But seeing it here, printed in black ink on white paper, inside a file that a stranger had paid money to obtain, made it into something entirely different. It wasn't her memory anymore. It had become documentation. Someone had read it. Someone had folded it up and put it in a file. Josie heard a ringing in her ears. She turned back to the first page, and only then did she notice the handwritten note in the upper right margin, written in blue ink, small and neat. 3 phrases separated by periods. In debt. No family. Suitable. Josie stood perfectly still for a long time. In her mind, the interview from 3 weeks earlier suddenly came back with painful clarity. The small room at the employment agency. The questions about whether she had anyone at home who depended on her, and she'd said no. The question about whether she had any ties in another city, and she'd said no. And the person across from her had nodded and written it down. She had thought those questions were meant to find out whether she could work long hours. She had thought the salary being 3 times what she'd earned before was simply because rich people paid generously. Now she understood they hadn't been looking for a good cook. They had been looking for someone with a debt large enough to keep her from asking questions, and with no one left in the world to tell. That salary wasn't generosity. It was a chain, and she'd put it around her own neck with her own hands and thanked them for it. Corinne waited until she could see that Josie understood, not a second sooner. Then she spoke, her voice still as calm as though they were discussing next week's menu. She said, "I know you went to Pawtucket on Tuesday." She said, "I also know you've been going up to the 3rd floor outside your assigned hours." She said, "I'm not trying to make things difficult for you. I understand people like you. Everyone gets desperate sometimes." Then she closed the file and rested both hands on top of it. She said, "You have until Monday morning to write your own resignation." She said, "I'll mark it as leaving for personal reasons. I'll still give you a reference. You can go work somewhere else, and no one will ask you anything." Then she said one final thing, and it was the only moment during the entire conversation when she lowered her voice. She said, "But if you're still here Monday morning, I'll have to speak to my husband about you." Josie left the study, closed the door behind her, and stood in the hallway for a while waiting for her knees to feel steady again. It was Friday. She had 2 days left. On Friday afternoon, Josie asked permission to go out. She took the cloth bag from behind the kitchen door, walked along the gravel path, and went all the way to the iron gate. The gatekeeper had already stood up and pressed the button to open it. The gate had slid halfway aside when Josie stopped. She stood there with one foot already across the line, looking down the road that led toward the bus stop. And everything in her mind was perfectly clear. On Monday morning she would write her resignation, take the letter of recommendation, and leave cleanly. She still owed $41,000, and still hadn't been able to buy a proper headstone. No one in this world could blame her for a single thing. Then she thought about the strip of yellow light beneath the 3rd floor door going dark at 10 o'clock at night. And she thought about a September afternoon 14 months earlier, and she understood that if she stepped through that gate, she would spend the rest of her life living with 2 untouched meal trays instead of 1. She turned around. The gatekeeper watched her, slightly confused, then pressed the button and closed the gate again. That evening, Josie called Mrs. Doyle. She said, "I need the recipe for Mrs. Rosaria's sauce. I need her exact recipe." There was silence on the other end for several seconds. Then Mrs. Doyle said, "All right, I'm going to tell you. Write it down." On Sunday morning, Josie got up at 6 o'clock. She walked to the market in town, bought ripe tomatoes with her own money, carried them back, and began cooking at 8. She followed Mrs. Doyle's instructions exactly. She didn't turn the heat down too soon. She didn't add sugar. She cooked the onions slowly until they became completely sweet, and she let the pot simmer for hours. By around 10 o'clock, the smell had begun creeping out of the kitchen. By noon, it had filled the entire ground floor, slipped into the dining room, and climbed toward the stair landing. Everyone who passed slowed their steps. One of the younger maids stopped at the kitchen doorway and asked whether guests were coming that day. Josie said no. Close to 2 in the afternoon, Mrs. Pruitt came downstairs. She stood in the kitchen doorway without stepping inside, her hands folded in front of her stomach. She looked at the large pot gently bubbling on the stove, looked at the pile of tomato skins in the basin, looked at Josie standing there stirring. She remained there for a very long time, long enough that Josie finally had to turn and look at her. Something was struggling across the face of that woman of 57, and Josie had already prepared herself to hear the housekeeper order her to turn off the stove. Mrs. Pruitt opened her mouth, then she closed it again. Her eyes lifted toward the ceiling, toward the 3rd floor, only for the briefest instant. Then she turned and walked away without saying a word, and for the rest of that afternoon she didn't come back into the kitchen once. Josie understood that this was everything the woman could give her. At 6 o'clock that evening, she turned off the stove. She went into the large dining room, the room she hadn't seen anyone use since the day she arrived, pulled the dust cover off the table, and set 2 places. She put one at the head of the table. The other she placed at the chair to its right. She carried in the plates, spooned out the sauce, and set a basket of bread in the middle. Then she stood there, looking at the table for a while. The long table with 14 seats and only 2 place settings side by side at one end. And it seemed both ridiculous and exactly right. Mrs. Pruitt passed the dining room doorway, glanced inside, and kept walking. At 6:30, the hour when Josie would normally carry the tray up to the 3rd floor, she climbed the stairs. This time her hands were empty. 19 steps. She counted every one. At the end of the hallway, she knocked. Mrs. Rosaria's voice told her to come in. The old woman was sitting in her usual place, facing the bay. Outside, night had already fallen, and the window reflected her faintly back into the room. She heard the door open, but there was no sound of a tray being placed on the table, so she turned around. She looked at Josie's empty hands. Then she looked up at her face. Josie said, "I'm not bringing your dinner up here anymore, ma'am." Mrs. Rosaria said nothing. Josie stepped closer and continued, "I came to take you downstairs." The room was silent for a long time. The old woman lifted one hand to the front of her blouse, a very small gesture, and Josie saw her fingers trembling. She said, "There are people down there already, child." Josie said, "I know." Mrs. Rosaria said, "You'll lose your job." Josie said, "I already did, ma'am, Friday morning." Mrs. Rosaria looked at her for a very long time. Then she said, "I can't walk quickly anymore." Josie stepped forward, stood beside the chair, and held out her hand. She said, "We don't have to be quick. No one downstairs is going anywhere. We can take as long as we need." The old woman looked at the hand being offered to her, the hand covered in oil burn scars and knife marks. Then she placed her own hand in it and began to stand. It took them nearly 4 minutes to make their way down all 19 steps. Mrs. Rosaria used both hands, one gripping the banister, the other resting on Josie's arm, and at every step she paused, lowered her right foot first, brought her left foot down after it, then took a breath before continuing. Josie didn't hurry her. At the 7th step, the old woman stopped completely and closed her eyes for a moment, and Josie thought she might turn back, but she only said, "I haven't used the stairs in a long time." Then she started down again. When they reached the 2nd floor landing, the smell of tomato sauce rising from below met them halfway. Mrs. Rosaria stopped, breathed it in, and Josie saw both of the old woman's shoulders settle downward. She didn't say anything. She simply stood there, breathing in that familiar scent for a few seconds, then said, "Come on, child." At the bottom of the staircase, the conversation in the dining room stopped. There were 3 people inside, Corinne and 2 of her guests, seated around the middle of the table. Corinne looked toward the doorway, and for one brief instant there was nothing on her face at all. Not anger, not fear, only the blankness of someone being forced to recalculate everything very quickly. Then she shot to her feet so abruptly that her chair scraped backward across the wooden floor. She said, "Take her back to her room. Right now." Josie didn't stop. She helped the old woman toward the head of the table, pulled out the chair there, and eased her down into it. She said, "I only want her to have one meal with her family, ma'am." Corinne came around the table. She said, "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" At that exact moment, the front door opened in the hall. Heavy, even footsteps entered the house, then stopped. Rocco stood in the dining room doorway, with his coat still on and his car keys still in his hand. He looked at the table. He looked at the two place settings arranged together at one end, the basket of bread, the steaming pot of sauce. Then he looked at his mother sitting in the chair at the head of the table, and he stood there far longer than anyone normally would. So long that Corinne finally had to say his name. He didn't answer, because inside that man's mind, there was one very simple question, for which he couldn't find an answer. When was the last time he had seen his mother sitting in that chair? He searched his memory for Thanksgiving. She wasn't there. He searched his birthday in June. She wasn't there. He searched the anniversary of his father's death. He remembered candles that day, remembered people, remembered voices and laughter. But when he tried to reconstruct the head of the table, the chair was empty. He couldn't remember. He had eaten in that room more times than he could count over the past 7 months, and had never once noticed that the chair at the head of the table was still there, clean, untouched, and empty. Corinne spoke again, louder this time, saying this girl brought her down without permission. I've already told her to take her back upstairs. Rocco still didn't look at her. He walked into the room, set his keys on the sideboard, took off his coat, and draped it over the back of a chair. Then he pulled out the chair to his mother's right and sat down. Josie spooned sauce onto a plate for Mrs. Rosaria, set it in front of her, then stepped back and said, "Just let her eat for a few minutes, please." No one said anything after that. Corinne's two guests sat motionless, staring down at their plates. Mrs. Rosaria raised her eyes. They met her son's, and this time he didn't look away. She reached for the spoon. Her hand was trembling so badly that the tip tapped lightly against the edge of the plate several times. She scooped up a spoonful, lifted it, and took the first bite. The dining room was so quiet that they could hear the sauce still gently simmering back in the kitchen. She took a second bite, then a third, and after that her hand began to tremble less. Rocco sat beside her, watching his mother eat without saying a word, and he didn't touch his own plate. She was halfway through when running footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Nella burst into the room, one of her braids completely undone. The little girl saw her grandmother sitting at the table, froze for 1 second, then cried out with delight, ran around her father's chair, and threw both arms around the old woman's neck. She laughed and said, "Grandma, you're downstairs eating dinner. I thought you were tired." Mrs. Rosaria set down her spoon, wrapped her arms around the child, and kissed the top of her head. Nella grabbed the napkin from the table and pushed it into her grandmother's hands, begging her to fold the rabbit, saying she'd practiced and practiced, but the ears always fell over. The old woman took the napkin. She made one fold, then another, turned it over, and pulled the 2 corners upward. The hands that had been trembling only moments earlier moved steadily now, because there are some things the hands remember longer than the mind does. The rabbit stood upright on the table with both ears perfectly straight. Nella burst out laughing and clapped her hands. Mrs. Rosaria laughed too, and it was the first time anyone in that house had heard her laugh out loud since spring. She reached up to smooth her granddaughter's hair, and at that exact moment her wedding ring slipped from her ring finger, fell onto the tabletop, rolled in a long arc, then tipped over and came to rest near Rocco. He bent down and picked it up. He held the ring in his palm, and that was when he looked at his mother's hand, looked at the wrist showing beneath the sleeve of her sweater, looked at the sharp line of her shoulder bone beneath the fabric. He sat there for a very long time with the ring in his hand. Across the table, Corinne gave a short laugh and said, "I suppose she's just feeling stronger today." No one answered her, not one person. Mrs. Rosaria finished everything on her plate. When she was done, she sat for a while longer, with one hand still resting on her granddaughter's shoulder, then said she was tired. Rocco stood, and this time he didn't call for anyone. He helped his mother out of the dining room himself, but he didn't take her upstairs. He guided her into the library, turned on the light, and pulled the armchair near the fireplace out for her to sit in. Then he went back to the doorway and told the 2 guests that the evening was over. He told Corinne to go upstairs. She stood in the middle of the hallway, opened her mouth as if she were about to say something, and he only looked at her once. She went upstairs. He told Josie to stay in the kitchen and not go anywhere. Then he closed the library door. Inside, There were only the two of them and the light from the desk lamp. Rocco didn't sit in the chair across from his mother. He pulled out the low stool beside the bookcase, placed it in front of her, and sat down on it, lower than she was, with both elbows resting on his knees. He asked her, "Mother, why did you stop eating?" "Mrs." Rosaria didn't answer right away. She looked down at the hands folded in her lap and turned the wedding ring her son had slipped back onto her finger earlier, rotating it once, then turning it back again. Then she said, "It isn't about the food, son." He asked what it was about then. She said she didn't know how to explain it in a way that would make him understand. She said that during the first few months she still came downstairs, still sat at the table, while everyone talked and she listened. Then she said there were evenings when she realized she had been sitting there and no one had asked her a single question, not because anyone hated her or meant to be unkind, only because their conversations no longer had any place where she was needed. Then, when people began carrying her meals upstairs, she had actually felt relieved at first. Truly relieved, she said, because she no longer had to sit at a table where she wasn't part of anything anymore. She said at first she thought that was all right. Then she said, "But son, when you eat alone for long enough, sooner or later even your stomach understands there isn't much reason left to be hungry." Rocco asked why she hadn't told him. "Mrs." Rosaria raised her eyes to him and smiled, a very small, very sad smile. She said, "You leave before the sun comes up." She said she lay upstairs every morning and heard his car start in the yard at 4:30, and she would think, "That boy is carrying this whole house on his shoulders. I'm old now. What does it matter if I don't eat a few meals? I shouldn't bother him over little things." She said she'd told herself that every day, and she hadn't realized that all those little things had added up to 7 months. Rocco sat in silence. Inside his mind, all the things he had walked past hundreds of times began coming back and lining themselves up, and this time they meant something. Thanksgiving dinner, he remembered asking where his mother was, and someone had answered that she'd eaten early because she was tired. He had nodded and sat down to eat. His birthday in June, he remembered the cake, the candles, the applause, and he couldn't remember where his mother had been in that room. He remembered mornings when he passed the kitchen door and saw the previous night's tray washed clean and turned upside down on the drying rack. He remembered lifting his phone, looking at a photograph of a plate with 1/3 missing, feeling reassured, and going to work. Every small absence he had never questioned because each one, by itself, had come with a kind and reasonable explanation already attached to it. He sat there with both hands clenched, and he didn't know where to put his anger because the first person who deserved it was sitting right there on that stool. It was a long time before he asked the second question. He asked, "Mother, are you afraid of anyone in this house?" "Mrs." Rosaria answered immediately. She said no. She said it too quickly. Faster than anything she'd said in the past half hour, so quickly that the answer seemed to leap forward before he had even finished asking the question, and immediately afterward she lowered her eyes and turned the ring around her finger once more. Rocco looked at that hand. He had spent 10 years sitting across from every kind of person, listening to every kind of answer, and he knew one thing very well. People only answered that quickly when the answer had been prepared long ago and practiced over and over. He didn't ask anything else. He took his mother upstairs, helping her one step at a time, and that night no one came up to lock the door. Then he returned to the library, sat beneath the desk lamp, and opened his phone. He went into the folder containing the photograph sent from the unnamed 10-digit number. He scrolled down and kept scrolling, while white plates passed across the screen one after another. Every one of them loosened and spread around, every one of them missing exactly 1/3, every one with the knife and fork crossed on the rim. He began to count. He counted all 211 photographs. At 4 o'clock the next morning, Rocco called the man in charge of security at the estate and told him to pull every piece of third-floor hallway camera footage from April to the present. The man worked for 2 hours, then came up to the library, stood in the doorway without quite daring to step all the way inside, and said the footage from the beginning of May through the end of October was gone. Rocco asked what he meant by gone. The man said it had been deleted, sir. Manually deleted, not lost because of a failed hard drive. Rocco told him to sit down and open the system logs. It turned out the system recorded everything. It couldn't preserve the images once someone deleted them, but it kept a record of every action, the date, the time, the login account, even the address of the computer that issued the command. There had been 3 deletions. The first was in July, the second in September, and the third was 11 days ago, close to 1 o'clock in the morning. All 3 had been carried out through the same account, and all 3 had come from the computer in the second-floor study. Rocco sat looking at the screen for a very long time. He told the security man to print 3 copies for him. In his years of doing business, he had learned that the most frightening thing was never what people left behind, but what they went to the trouble of erasing. People didn't erase harmless things. By 9 o'clock that morning, Sal Rizzo had arrived. He was past 60, had served as an advisor to the family since Rocco's father's time, and he was the only man in Providence allowed to enter the library without announcing himself first. He placed 2 things on the desk. The first was a fairly thick blue folder containing Mrs. Rosaria's medical records prepared by Dr. Warren Hollis, with entries made regularly twice a month, continuously from April until now. Rocco turned the pages one by one. Cognitive decline, disorientation in time, signs of nighttime confusion, refusal of food and drink, lacks capacity to manage personal assets. Every page ended with Hollis's signature and medical license number. Rocco read the final page, then closed the folder. He said, "My mother folded a napkin into a rabbit for her granddaughter yesterday in 10 seconds. The second file was much thinner, only about 10 pages, and Sal pushed it across the desk more slowly. It was a draft petition, seeking the appointment of a legal guardian for Rosaria Santangelo, prepared by a law office in Boston, fully completed, already signed on the line for the petitioner, lacking only the filing stamp. The petitioner was Corinne. In the section listing the assets that would fall under the guardian's control were 3 harbor properties, the family's shipping company, 2 buildings downtown, and the entirety of the legitimate equity his father had transferred into his wife's name before he died. At the top corner of the first page was a lawyer's note, stating that the petition would be eligible for filing once there were at least 6 continuous months of medical records, and the expected filing date was the morning of December 26th. Rocco looked at the date. Today was the 18th. He set the paper down very slowly and sat without moving for a long time. Then Sal spoke, quietly, without a trace of accusation, and it hurt precisely because there was none. He said, "I told you once." Rocco looked up. Sal said, "In the 2nd month." He said, "I came in here, sat in this exact chair, and told you there was something wrong with what was happening to your mother, that you needed to go upstairs and see for yourself." He said, "You told me I'd hated the Voss girl since the day you married her, and that I shouldn't drag your mother into it." When he finished, he fell silent and said nothing more, only looked down at the surface of the desk. Rocco remembered that afternoon. He remembered the exact sentence he'd spoken, and remembered the tone he'd used when he said it. He remembered Sal standing up, giving a single nod, and leaving, and from that day forward never bringing the subject up again. That afternoon, Rocco drove to Dr. Hollis's clinic on the east side of the city. Hollis was seeing his final patient out when he saw Rocco walk in. Rocco didn't close the door, didn't raise his voice, and didn't step more than 1 pace closer to him. He simply placed a stack of documents on the desk, opened them to the page, showing the owner of the building and the chain of companies behind it, and said, "You've been paying rent on this place to my company for 11 years without knowing it." He said, "Now you know." Then he walked out, leaving the papers exactly where they were. 4 hours later, close to 10 o'clock that night, his phone vibrated. It was Hollis. He said he wanted to rewrite everything, by hand, and that he wanted to surrender his medical license before someone else did it for him. Rocco went up to the 3rd floor close to midnight. His mother's door wasn't locked, and the light was still on. Mrs. Rosaria was sitting in the armchair beside the window with Nella's drawing in her hands, and she didn't look surprised to see him, as though she had been sitting there waiting for this conversation for 7 months, and simply hadn't known which night it would finally come. He didn't pull over a chair. He walked to her, sat down on the floor beside her feet, and leaned his back against the side of her chair, exactly the way he used to sit when he was a boy while she sewed. He placed the thick blue folder and the thinner file on the floor in front of her, then said, "I know now, Mother." He said he knew about the medical records, knew about the guardianship petition, knew about the 26th. He said he'd taken care of everything, that she didn't have to be afraid anymore. Then he looked up at her and said, "But you still haven't told me everything." Mrs. Rosaria was silent for a very long time. She lowered Nella's drawing onto her lap and smoothed one curled corner flat, and Josie would later understand, when the story was told to her, that it was during that small motion of smoothing the paper that the 74-year-old woman was deciding for the last time whether she should continue carrying the burden alone. Then she said, "Do you remember back in April?" She said that day she'd gone down to the library to look for his grandmother's prayer book, and because she walked slowly, no one had heard her coming, and someone inside was on the phone. She said she'd stood outside the door and heard everything. Rocco didn't ask anything. He waited. "Mrs. Rosaria said, that petition isn't the end of it, son. It's only the first step." She said she'd heard them say that once the guardianship papers were approved by the court, once the family's legitimate assets were under their control, then the second step would begin. She said there was a file. She said she hadn't understood everything they were saying. She only remembered certain words. They talked about the harbor, about shipments, about records from years ago, and they said the copies were complete and being kept in Boston. She said they told each other that those documents would be handed over to someone else at exactly the moment the paperwork was finalized, because by then, son, you would have to disappear from Providence. Do you understand? You would have to be gone so no one could ever go back and undo anything. Rocco sat motionless on the floor. "Mrs. Rosaria continued, her voice trembling, but she didn't stop. She said she'd stood outside the library that day for about 3 minutes, then gone back upstairs and sat down in this very chair. She said she'd stayed there all night thinking. She said she knew his nature. She said, I gave birth to you. I raised you. I know that if I told you what I heard, you wouldn't be able to sit still for even one night. You would go looking for that file. You would go looking for whoever was holding it." And then she said, "Son, the day you did that, everything written inside those papers would become true. No one would need to prove anything anymore. You would be the one signing your name beneath it with your own actions." She said she'd turned it over in her mind again and again for 7 months and hadn't found a way out. If she told him, she would lose him. If she stayed silent, she would lose everything else. So she chose silence. She thought she could bear it. She thought she was old already, and what harm could there be if she simply sat upstairs and kept quiet? She raised one hand to her throat, a very small gesture, and said what she hadn't expected was how heavy it would become. She said every evening they brought the tray upstairs, and she would sit in front of it and stare at the food. And inside her mind, there were only those same few words turning over and over again. She said she would pick up the spoon and then put it back down. Then she looked directly into her son's eyes and said the words he would carry with him for the rest of his life. She said, "I wasn't starving myself, son," she said. "I just couldn't swallow." The room fell completely silent. Outside, the bay was black, and somewhere far away a ship's light blinked in the darkness. Rocco was still sitting on the floor with his head lowered and both hands resting on his knees. Then his shoulders began to shake. The man whose name made all of Providence lower its voice sat crying at his mother's feet like a little boy, without making a sound. "Mrs. Rosaria reached out, placed her hand on his head, and left it there for a very long time. After a while, he finally managed to speak. He asked, 7 months, Mother. You sat up here alone for 7 months carrying that." She said yes. He asked why she hadn't sent him away, why she hadn't cursed him, why she kept telling him she was fine. "Mrs. Rosaria stroked his hair and said, Son, every evening you came up here and stood in the doorway and asked me 3 questions, and I could see how tired you were." She said, "I had 40 seconds each day to look at your face." She said, "I couldn't bring myself to use those 40 seconds to make you afraid." On the night of December 24th, Rocco had the large dining table set for all 14 places, lit the candles, and told the household staff to stand around the room. Mrs. Pruitt had taken Nella upstairs early with a new box of crayons, and the little girl sat happily drawing, completely unaware of the things the adults were dealing with downstairs. Rocco had prepared everything he needed to say to his wife, but at exactly 7 o'clock, the front door opened, and the person who walked in wasn't Corinne. It was a man in his 60s, his gray hair neatly combed, a leather briefcase in one hand, and he entered the dining room with the bearing of someone accustomed to walking into other people's homes without waiting to be invited. Gerald Voss had come from Boston a day early without warning. He sat down in the chair across from Rocco, placed the briefcase on the table, and said he hadn't come for dinner. He opened the case, took out the guardianship petition, turned to the final page, and pushed it across the table with a pen. He said, "Tomorrow morning my law office is filing this with the court." He said, "If you sign here as the consenting family member, everything goes smoothly. No one has to appear in court. No one has to testify. And your mother stays exactly where she's been for the past 7 months, upstairs in her room." He said, "If you don't sign, then we'll do it the longer way. And the longer way always means more people have to say more things out loud." Rocco didn't pick up the pen. He reached for the stack of papers he'd placed beside his chair and began laying them on the table one by one. The first was the printed camera system log, showing 3 separate deletions. all 3 carried out from the computer in the second-floor study, complete with dates, times, and account information. The second was Dr. Warren Hollis's handwritten statement, 14 pages detailing the entire fabrication of Mrs. Rosaria's medical records beginning in April, along with the petition he had already filed to surrender his medical license. The third was a stack of printed photographs, 211 in all, each one showing a white plate with the food loosened and 1/3 missing. The fourth thing, which he placed down last, was a small ivory-colored postal receipt dated 7 months earlier, with Rocco's own 3-stroke signature in the recipient box. Gerald Voss looked down at the table and said nothing for a very long time. Then Rocco rested his hand on one final hardbound file that had been lying face down beside him. Everyone in the room knew what was inside because Sal Rizzo had spent 3 days bringing it back from Boston. It contained everything the Voss family had managed to copy regarding the harbor, and it also contained enough to expose the Voss family themselves, enough to start a war between 2 families that no one could predict the end of. Rocco sat there for a long time with his hand resting on that file. He thought about his daughter upstairs drawing. He thought about what kind of woman a 7-year-old child would become if she grew up in a house where every door had to be checked twice, and every adult carried a list of people who needed to pay. Then he slid the file across the table toward Gerald Voss. He said, "Take this back with you," he said. "I keep my mother." No one in the room dared breathe too loudly. Gerald Voss looked at the file, then at the papers spread across the table, and he understood that he had just been given a way out he didn't deserve, and that the price of that way out was complete withdrawal. He folded the guardianship petition, put it back into his briefcase, stood, and left without another word. The next morning, Corinne left Providence and returned to Boston. The guardianship petition was never filed. Dr. Hollis lost his medical license the following month. Nella continued seeing her mother on the agreed occasions. That night, after everyone else had gone, Mrs. Rosaria sat at the head of the table watching her son gather the papers, and she said, "I don't need anyone to pay for this, son," she said. "I only wanted to sit down with you one more time." 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning, Josie came into the kitchen at 8 o'clock and stopped dead in the doorway. Mrs. Rosaria was already there, her apron tied neatly around her waist, a wooden spoon in her hand as she stirred a pot of tomato sauce bubbling gently on the stove. On her ring finger, the wedding band fit again and no longer spun freely around her finger. Beside her, Nella stood on a small stool with both hands covered in flour, stirring and giggling because her grandmother had just told her something funny. From that evening forward, the chair at the head of the table was never empty again, and Rocco rearranged his work so he could be home before 7 o'clock. Before Josie prepared to leave, he handed her a check. She looked at the amount, pushed it back toward him, and said, "Seeing her eat again was enough for me." He didn't insist. But 2 weeks later, he drove her to the cemetery in Woonsocket. The white plastic marker that had once leaned crooked in the grass was gone. In its place stood a stone headstone engraved with the name Marion Whitaker, and beneath it, in smaller letters, were the words, "She never ate alone." Josie knelt in front of the stone and cried for a very long time, while the man behind her remained several steps away and said nothing. That evening, Mrs. Rosaria took Josie's 2 hands, scarred from oil burns, and held them inside her own. She said they were the most beautiful hands she had ever seen in that house. Then she pointed to the chair at her right and asked Josie to sit down, not as the cook, but as someone who belonged there. There are kinds of hunger that don't live in the stomach, and no meal can cure them. A dining table isn't only a place where people share food. It also tells us who still has a place in the home. Love delayed long enough can become heavier than every illness put together. And if there is a chair in your home that no one has sat in for a long time, please don't wait until someone has to ask why. If Mrs. Rosaria's story touched you tonight, please like and share it so that more people remember there may be a phone call home they still need to make, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to new and compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Is there someone in your family eating alone whom you haven't found the time to visit yet? Please leave a comment below. We sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.